So you can look ahead in copper and say we are heading into a shortage. It is coming. There is no doubt about that.
Hello, this is Florian Munch from Germany. I'm here at the Sprott Natural Resources Investment Symposium in Vancouver in 2019, and with me is Adrian Day, a commodity expert and renowned money manager, and one of those persons I followed for quite some years in the natural resources industry. So I'm very glad we finally meet, Adrian.
Well, thank you, Florian. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I would like to ask you some more general questions about commodity investing and natural resources investing. So, what would you say are the most important factors when it comes to investing in natural resources?
When it comes to investing in natural resources, I think the most important factor is to remember it's a very cyclical business, extremely cyclical, and there's reasons for that. You know, the fundamental economic reason for that is that price signals from increased demand take a long time to get to the ultimate producer. So if, for example, I have a retail store selling shoes, and every week I sell 1,000 shoes, and one week it's 980 and the next week it's 960, I can immediately ask the supplier to cut back next month's delivery.
Yeah.
Maybe shoes wasn't a good idea. Did I say shoes? Because then we get to cows at the other end of the chain. So that's not a very good example. But you understand, if I'm selling a product retail, I get immediate price signals, and depending on my contract with my supplier, I can cut back immediately. That takes time to go through from the distributor to the wholesaler and ultimately to the producer of the metals. The producer of the metals is the last person to get those price signals, right? So number one, demand can change and it takes a long time for him to get the signal. Secondly, because projects, most metal projects are huge capital investments, it therefore takes time for a company to make the decision to go ahead with a new mine, and it takes time before that production ever hits the market.
Yeah.
So the time lag from when demand changes up or down to when the supply changes up or down is very, very long. And therefore you have these very big swings in prices when the production hasn't caught up with increased demand, or conversely when demand has sunk but production hasn't. So that's the first thing to realize about the commodity business. And from the investment point of view, of course, because of those huge price swings, you find huge swings in the value and the prices of the producers and the explorers of the stocks. That's the most important thing, I think.
This is certainly true in a multi-year environment. Would you say there are kinds of super cycles?
Super cycles, yes. I think the big thing about commodities, if you look at commodities, let's say over 1,000 years, commodities, other things, the prices of commodities, other things being equal, tend to go down. Inexorably, slowly. Over time they decline. But you have these relatively short periods, I just said 1,000 years, so within 1,000 years, you have relatively short periods where you get huge increases in price. And those periods typically come from periods when you have a big increase in demand, right? So you can have supply shocks like the Arab oil crisis in the 70s, but that's very, very short term when you have a supply shock. But the big increases for super cycles, if you want to use the phrase you just used, come from that big increase in demand. So you look at base metal prices, which declined basically from the 1600s all the way to the beginning of the 19th century, just long-term decline. Then you had the Industrial Revolution. So from 1815, after we smashed Napoleon, no, from 1815 to about 1840, when the British Industrial Revolution was at its height, you had a huge boom in all commodity, including metal, but all commodity prices. Then from about 1870 to 1914, when the German Industrial Revolution was underway, you had another big spike in demand and in prices for commodities. What we've seen recently, of course, is China, the industrialization of China, and that has caused that huge, from 2000 through to 2011, that caused that huge boom. But that cycle's not over yet. China is still industrializing, and behind China, you have other countries, Brazil, Indonesia, which are very, very large.
So in the emerging markets, people are moving up from being poor to the middle class, and this consumes more natural resources?
No, absolutely.
Okay.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, a person living in a village in China or a person living in a small town in Brazil, I mean, they watch television, they know what's available, they know people elsewhere have fridges and have washing machines, and you know, they want that too, why not? And all that stuff consumes enormous amounts of commodities. So that's that's the sort of basic sort of concept of why you have these big super cycles. And of course things can change. It depends on the macroeconomic policies in the countries, in Brazil, in Indonesia, you know, as to when and how much they industrialize, but at some point it will happen, and then we'll get that big demand.
You just said before that that natural resources as an investment vehicle can burn money in the long run. If I understood that right.
Sorry,
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say it makes sense for money managers like yourself or other money managers to invest in natural resources as part of their portfolios?
I think
in general and currently.
Yes. I think gold belongs in portfolios at all times because it can act as insurance, and that's different from copper or nickel. So gold should be in portfolios at all times. I'm not necessarily saying that commodities should be in portfolios at all times, but I certainly think commodities are a significant part of the economy, but they should be watched at all times by managers and when appropriate be in portfolios. Certainly for the last 30 years I think they should be in, or 20 years they should be in portfolios, and I think now is a very good time to have exposure to commodities across the board, because basically the story differs. I mean, I mentioned super cycles come typically from increases in demand, but you also have supply issues with many commodities, copper being the most obvious example, where with copper, you look at copper, for example, big copper mines, large copper mines are very, very rare. So you look at a mine that everybody's heard of called Oyu Tolgoi, which was a great discovery and a great mine. That's the number 10 producer right now. It doesn't even come into the top 10 mines in the world in terms of size. You look at most of the largest mines in the world, excuse me, and they're over 100 years old. Bingham Canyon in the States, or most of the big Chilean mines, Chuqui is about 150 years old now. Obviously, these mines have huge staying power, obviously, but as mines begin to get really old, you go deeper and you get more fragile. The rock becomes more fragile. So in Chile, for example, you can have an earthquake 100 miles away that causes disruption at the mine because it's so deep underground.
And not so many high-class deposits are found nowadays.
We're finding very few. The last really big one found was Grasberg, and that went into production in the modern exploration went in the 1960s. I mean, that's a long time ago for one of your major mines to be discovered. The other thing about copper, I don't know if we want to carry on this, because the other thing about copper is the time lag from discovery to production is very, very long. I mentioned Grasberg. It was actually discovered in the 1920s. But the modern, if you like, discovery and modern exploration started in the 60s, went into production 25 years later, which was relatively short period for copper. But even once they've discovered, it takes at least 6 years. Richard Atkinson, who's the CEO of Freeport, the largest publicly traded copper mine in the world, copper company in the world, they've recently put all their new projects on hold until they have clarity on the copper price. A different issue. But he was asked a question, and and his answer was quite astonishing. He said, if we press a button today on one of our shovel-ready projects, already permitted, shovel-ready, it'll be at least 6 years before we have production. The point of that is that you can look ahead 6 years and know with, I won't say absolute, but with pretty absolute clarity how much production you're going to have in 7 years. At the minimum, we can say that there's nothing going to be producing in 7 years that we don't already know about today. And so you can look ahead in copper and say we are heading into a shortage. It is coming. There is no doubt about that.